Herodotus is often referred to as the father of history. His 4-volume work, aptly titled Histories, can be found in one of the most venerable libraries in the world, the Loeb Classical Library. In his work, Herodotus mentions several ancient kingdoms, the kingdoms of Arabia and Saba, often mentioned in the Psalms, and many more. One kingdom, that of Medes, has a particular connection to today. For it has long since been believed that the Magi, who we hear of in Matthew's Gospel this morning, hailed from deep within that same empire, the empire known as Persia. The kings are mysterious, and the legends that surround them are at the same time moving, extremely moving, and fantastical, scripturally based, and yet mythological. What is more is that we love them. We love these stories of the three kings. And that in itself is a truth that we must wrestle with within our own hearts. Two traditions have arisen and find themselves front and center at the end of the Christmas season. Two traditions surrounding the wise men. One tradition is that they showed up 13 days after the birth of Jesus. 13 days after Jesus was born is Epiphany, right? And the wise men showed up at the manger. And so you often see them depicted in art as in the manger. Sometimes you buy nativity sets, and you better bet one of those things is the three kings that you're getting with those. So that's one tradition, right? The other tradition is based off of what we hear of in Matthew's Gospel today, in that they believe that the wise men showed up sometime, probably 2 years after Jesus' birth, and that coincides with the massacre of the innocents that Matthew reveals. When King Herod heard, he was frightened, and he sent his soldiers to Bethlehem to slay the firstborn in that town. And that was for every child under the age of 2. And so sometimes they believe that the Magi showed up at the house, because in Matthew, it doesn't say that the Magi end up at the manger. It says that they entered the house. Did you catch that? So these are the sort of two traditions that have arisen. Both traditions, however, have the visitors numbering 3, and that is based solely in Scripture on the number of gifts that were present: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. The tradition that they were kings is found nowhere in the canon of Scripture. It is only found in the apocryphal writings. And it was, in fact, a 3rd century Christian by the name of Tertullian who finally referred to these magi, these wise men, as kings, probably as a way to differentiate them from being sorcerers, from astrologers, from those stargazers, right? So he made that distinction in the 3rd century. Over the years, both of those traditions developed in a sense that the three kings, the three magi, the three wise men, resembled the races of humanity. In depictions in art, you can often see one of the kings as a Caucasian male. You can also see an African, usually Balthazar. And then the other one is often depicted as an Asian man. In other traditions, the three kings are supposed to represent the 3 ages of man. You'll see one with a very gray beard, indicating a man mature, right? One with a brown beard, a full brown beard, indicating that he's in the prime of life. And then there's one king, usually Casper, that is beardless, indicating that he's a young man. It wasn't until the 9th century that the Magi were given proper names, Caspar, Balthazar, and Melchior, and that they were paired with the gifts that they brought, right? Caspar was the one who brought gold, which is, in a sense, to signify kingship, right? Balthazar brought frankincense, which is used in worship, right? And Melchior, it was said, was the one who brought myrrh, which is typically used in embalming. And that was a foretelling of Christ's death and burial. In the century's sense, it is believed that St. Helena, Constantine's mother, found the relics of these 3 wise men deep within India, not long before her own death. And desiring to enshrine their remains, as she had done many others, she had the sarcophagus that held the 3 of them brought to Constantinople. Years later, that sarcophagus was moved to Milan and now has its home in Cologne Cathedral, where it still remains today. So if you want to go over there, you can visit the 3 kings. But the legend doesn't stop there. In 1935, a curious reference surfaced in a periodical by the Georgia Mineral Society, listing the world's largest sapphires. One of them was called the Star of Artaban. In 1943, the sapphire was purchased in Sri Lanka and eventually found itself in the Natural History Museum of the Smithsonian Institute. The article referencing the minutes of that meeting wherein the gem was donated ends with this paragraph. We learned that a member of our society purchased the world's largest sapphire, the Star of Artaban, and has presented the stone anonymously to the National Museum in Washington. These minutes serve to preserve the anonymity of the donor. Who is Artaban? Accepting that the tradition of the wise men were 3, based solely on their gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, one item that is mentioned in the Gospels is conspicuously missing from the list: the pearl of great price. And thus the tale of the 4th wise man begins. Like the other Magi, Artaban sees a sign in the heavens proclaiming that a king has been born amongst the Jews. And like the other 3, he sets out from Medes to find the newborn ruler, carrying these treasures, 3 in fact: a sapphire, a ruby, and a pearl. However, as Artaban sets out for Babylon, need stops him along the way in order to help a dying man. The story tells us that he voluntarily parts with the blue sapphire in return for food, lodging, and medical care to be provided by the owner of the inn, not only for himself, but for the badly injured stranger who was robbed and beaten by thieves. I wonder what story that reminds you of. This, of course, makes him late, and he misses the caravan of the other three. Artaban commences his journey across the desert nevertheless, but arrives in Bethlehem too late to see the child, whose parents have already fled to Egypt. It was there that Artaban saw for himself what the soldiers of King Herod had done, whereupon a captain of the soldiers burst into a house that was nearby him, finding a young mother who was holding tight her baby to avoid the raiders. As the captain was moving towards the terror-stricken woman with his sword drawn, it was Artaban who intervened and offered the soldier the second precious jewel he possessed, the red ruby, if he would spare the life of the woman and her baby. The captain accepted the offer and snatched the ruby from Artaban's hand and left the house. He then wandered for 30 years, searching for his king, and was now old, frail, feeble, and penniless, having parted with all his valuable possessions to help the needy. And the story picks back up with Artaban on the streets of Jerusalem, where alone, nearing the end of his days, he learns that the governor, Pontius Pilate, was about to kill the king by crucifying him. In that moment, Artaban decides that he would seek Pontius Pilate out and plead for the release of this king by offering him the world's largest and whitest pearl. However, on his way to see the governor, he was beset by a group of slave sellers who were dragging a young man who had been abducted from his parents' home. The man was screaming and appealed for Artaban's help. And legend has it that Artaban intervened on behalf of the young man and bartered his last possession, the pearl, in exchange for his freedom. In his dying moments, Artaban prayed to God and sought his forgiveness, and not being able to meet him, offer his gifts, and serve him. And it was then that Artaban heard a voice from heaven saying, "My brother, you have already given me your 3 precious jewels. For when you gave them away to those in need, you gave them to me." I love that story. My mom bought that story for my dad on one of their first Christmases together. And whether you believe these traditions of the wise men to be factual or not, there is truth within them. What remains for us to balance is this. The story of Artaban is a work of fiction published by Henry Van Dyke in 1895. The gem, the Star of Artaban, was found in Sri Lanka in the 20th century under British colonial rule. However, what one cannot deny is the influence of the story of these kings and how they have affected the Christmas story. And that Jesus is always calling on us to find him in the lives of those who need him the most, saying that if you offer what you have to the least of my brethren, you have indeed offered it to me. And thus we have what the mystic and teacher Howard Thurman refers to as the work of Christmas. And that when the song of the angels is stilled, when the star in the sky is gone, and the kings and princes are back in their homes, and when the shepherds are back with their flocks, that is when the work of Christmas begins. And the work of Christmas remains the work of our lives.